All right. An excellent film buff's book is now on release at bookshops, and it's a book by Ross Campbell called Melbourne and the Movies: Confessions of a Certified Cinephile. And it's my great pleasure to be speaking to Ross Campbell. Ross, welcome to Movie Metropolis.
And it's my great pleasure to join you, Peter, on these digital airwaves.
Absolutely. Great to talk to you. And this is such an incredible book, so well researched. What was the inspiration behind you writing this book?
Well, you and I and other film buffs know the story of Melbourne's film culture, which is deep and long lasting and dating from the earliest days of motion pictures. There's been a whole lot of people involved in creating that culture, which I suggest is quite unique to Melbourne. I think Melbourne's about the best film capital in Australia, really, as far as film culture is concerned. I knew the story, you knew it, but a lot of cinema goers didn't, Peter, and I thought it was incumbent upon me to set the record straight. There's a whole lot of people to be acknowledged whose wonderful work they did, sometimes quite often unpaid. And we share a very rich culture today, but it was during COVID lockdown, Peter, that it all came to pass. I had all this wonderful time. I took a leaf out of, dare I say, Groucho Marx's playbook in terms of my work ethic. How does it go? Up every morning at 6, breakfast, back in bed by 7.
Love it. Uh,
Each day started with a good deal of research, as you can imagine.
yeah.
And Peter, was a 3-year project, actually, 450 pages, densely packed, with, dare I say, lots of illustrations as well.
And you cover so much ground in terms of your own experience with cinema and other things that you've done, including being a projectionist, being a filmmaker, and film music being such an important part of your history, I suppose.
Film music does play a large part, but just as music has played a large part in my life also. I used to crouch at the piano at the feet of my brother's friends who would be playing marvelous Chopin preludes and polonaises. And I think my mother was quoted as saying she'd have the piano before carpets. So music was paramount in our household. It was, and both my parents enjoyed going to the cinema. They did so before they were married. And as we were growing up, all four of us, we all participated in going to the cinema. There's a great love across the entire family of going to the pictures, as we used to call it, Peter.
Absolutely, I fully understand that, and music, as I said, is so important. And because you've worked with a number of silent films, with putting music scores to them, and also in cinemas where you've used music as intro to a film or outro or whatever the case might be. I find that really quite fascinating.
Music and the movies have gone hand in hand since the very beginning. As we both know, silent films were never silent.
Mm.
They were always accompanied, sometimes by large orchestras in big theatres, a Wurlitzer organ capable of sound effects as well. And even there was a cinema here in Melbourne, and they had an orchestra of 25 players. Now that's just in Armadale, High Street Armadale, the Armadale Theatre.
Mm.
Amazing the things you find out when you're researching, Peter. So
Yes.
there were, in fact, silent films were the greatest employers of musicians throughout the world. And I was inspired by the work of Kevin Brownlow and Carl Davis in particular, both working out from London, the composer, conductor Carl Davis, and the film restorer, Kevin Brownlow, who did so much work throughout his 40-year career in restoring silent films so that they can be seen today in the glory that they once had. We're talking about films that were printed on nitrate film stock. And the legendary nitrate, Peter, that sort of conjures up all sorts of vibrations amongst film enthusiasts as soon as you mention nitrate. It was made from gun cotton with sulfuric and hydrochloric acid, creating a film which was fibrous, which was organic, And somehow the photographic emulsion on that nitrate film exhibited a luster which was never occurred again after the replacement of nitrate film, because it was highly inflammable back in 1950. Photographically, films never quite looked as lustrous as they did back in that time. So audiences of the day saw extremely beautiful images on the screen with extraordinary, sometimes quite subtle acting, not at all like the way in which silent screen acting is parodied in Gene Kelly's Singing in the Rain, those over-dramatic, melodramatic gestures and so on.
Yeah.
Silent cinema at its best created a new art form of improvisation, of the actors whose images were large on the big cinema screen. As Gloria Swanson said, we had faces then, and those faces were capable of interpreting the most subtle of human emotions. It was a case of thought being photographed. And even today, the best screen acting is the acting in which we participate in the inner thoughts of the character on screen.
Absolutely, fully agree with that. And yes, I'm such a great advocate for silent cinema. And I mean, that's why I named my show Movie Metropolis, because Metropolis being my
Yes,
uh,
of course.
all-time favorite silent film. But it's interesting how Kevin Brownlow, was responsible for that wonderful series, which it's a shame we can't see anymore, Hollywood, which looked at the history of silent cinema, and it was I remember seeing it on television, and it's just disappeared.
Yes. When it was on television, first of all on Channel 9 with advertisements, if you please, and truncated slightly. Then ABC television got it and ran it in its entirety, each of the 13 episodes without any break. And it was in very high quality then that we saw it on ABC. Some of us had the foresight to videotape those episodes. The episodes of Hollywood, as it's now called, Hollywood beginning with The Pioneers, is now available on YouTube. Not as good quality because sadly, the owners of the copyright of those many extracts that were shown in that series were demanding a king's ransom for copyright clearance, something which either Thames Television or Kevin Brownlow could afford at all. So it's in a sense in a digital limbo, but these episodes can be seen on YouTube and in not as good quality as we saw them when they were first broadcast and transmitted.
Okay. Well, that's some compensation, but not complete. It's interesting to hear that. Now, I like the way you've structured your book, Melbourne and the Movies, because it's rich with information, with experiences, with illustrations, and so on. It's quite an extensive history of Melbourne cinema, and as well as your own history. Tell me about that process.
Lavishly illustrated, I think one of the reviewers called it, Peter. And I was very thrilled with that because I did work hand in glove with a great book designer, a chap called Bill Kerr, with whom I'd worked professionally previously. And he organised me in terms of getting the photographs all together, chapter by chapter, envelope by envelope. And on the first occasion, when he said, I've got a few chapters, I'd sent him the manuscript, the finished manuscript, and the photographs to accompany it. When he turned the pages over on the PDF on the screen, page after page, I had to say to him, Bill, I had no idea it was going to look so beautiful. The art of the book designer, Peter. It's a wonderful thing. So just getting back to your question, it is a vast story to tell, and I wanted to tell it as comprehensively as I could, both as from an outsider. I was privileged to be up and running in some cases, particularly with the Melbourne Film Festival in earlier days, and then later days with the Melbourne International Film Festival, with people like Tate Brady and Sandra Starledge. I was there both as a participant and as an observer. So those two strings to my bow enabled me to sort of comprehensively range across the whole story, Peter, of the film culture that we enjoy so much today. When you think about it, Peter, There's a film festival on in Melbourne almost every other month, isn't there?
Yes.
It's the Italian Film Festival, German Film Festival, this, that, and the other. Cinemas like Cinema Nova, the Palace chain, Eddie Tamir with his cinemas at Elstonwick and Ferry. Um, that wasn't always necessarily the case because back in the heyday, but for about 40 years, Melbourne cinema going was confined to Hollywood and British product. They dominated our suburban and city theatres. It was an enormous output at the time in the heyday of the film studios. But we, as Melburnians particularly, and Victorians as well, we knew that there was cinema out there in the world, foreign language cinema. The Savoy Theatre in Russell Street gave us an inkling of that with their, quotes, continental films that they showed. So there we could see French and Italian and other films from other countries. The Film Society movement was a spontaneous coming together of film enthusiasts. That was wonderful because whether they met in church halls or little places not necessarily as cinemas, with a 16mm projector or two, they could, from the various embassies, the French embassy, for example, cultural services of the French embassy in Canberra, or the Goethe Institute, films could be borrowed for the price of transport only and shown to appreciative groups who'd gather, see the films and chat about it, talk about it afterwards. Supper was almost as important as the actual screening. But it was that film movement that precipitated the Melbourne Film Festival, which had those 30 glorious years at 20 glorious years at the Palais Theatre, St Kilda, under the stewardship of Erwin Rado. And today, there are in Victoria 80, no less than 80 film societies active and screening on a monthly basis. That's pretty good news, Peter, isn't it? It's very
Yes.
typical of a community that enjoys film at so many levels.
Absolutely, and of course you've been involved in so much of the Melbourne Film Festival and with the Erwin Rado Theatre and the Longford Theatre, and in particular also in terms of projection and getting it right in terms of focus and making sure that audiences see films properly, not in a condition that isn't appropriate. So I'm very impressed by the way you've done all that.
You mentioned the Longford Cinema, and that, of course, entails mentioning Natalie Miller, who now operates, as you know, Cinema Nova. But Natalie Miller, back in the day, was the press secretary for Erwin Rado. She was his publicist, free, gratis, and for nothing, I must say. And she learnt so much from Erwin, and then went into her own distribution and exhibition work that we know and love. But the film festival continued on, and at the Erwin Rado Theatre, why did we call it the Erwin Rado? Because Erwin Rado, as I say, for 30 years had been its esteemed film director. Erwin came from an Hungarian background. He was also a trained concert pianist too, Peter, and I had the privilege of sitting down in his home, and he said, now this is how a Westerner would play Bela Bartok. Okay, he played a piece and he said, and now this is how an Hungarian would play it. It's completely different. You know, I had a similar experience with my music teacher, Robert Kohner, who had come out from Berlin in 1936, escaping you know what. And he, on board the ship, traveling out, they screened Marx Brothers, A Night at the Opera. Robert always maintained that that depiction of an opera company was probably the most accurate he'd ever experienced. It says a lot for opera companies. But one day I mentioned to Robert Cohn, I was very much enthusiastic of the film music of Eric Wolfgang Korngold. And I'd encountered Korngold on seeing a film called King's Row from 1941. It first appeared on Channel 7. I was only 16 when I saw it, Peter, a very vulnerable teenager, as you can imagine. And when I hadn't heard film music like this before. It was a Warner Brothers film. And at my local cinema, the Camden Caulfield, it was an independent theatre, and they ran MGM, Paramount, and but not Warner Brothers material. So when this film came up, I'd never heard music like this ever before. It was strong, it was intensely melodic, shades of Puccini, and I was so enthralled, I wrote to Channel 7 asking who was the composer and who was the director. I knew none of these names, they were not familiar to me. And they wrote back and gave me the list, the cast list and the director, and they said, unfortunately, we don't know the name of the composer. I showed this to my teacher at school who ran lunchtime music appreciation classes. He looked at that and he wrote in big letters, Eric Wolfgang Korngold. The name just conjures up the whole Viennese school, doesn't it?
Yes.
And when I told my teacher, Robert Kona, I said, I'm going to be watching King's Row next week on television. So it was being repeated. He said, Korngold. He said, next week I shall have a surprise for you. A reason to practice even harder for that next lesson. At the end of that lesson, on the grand piano, which filled most of the room, the front room of his house in Eastern Kilda, he opened up this page after page of music manuscript. Der Schneemann, it was written at the top. The Snowman, said Robert, written when Korngold was 11 years of age. And then he pointed to a dedication up in the top right-hand corner. To my friend Robert Kona, on the occasion of his 18th birthday, Eric Wolfgang Korngold. He then proceeded to play sequences from The Snowman. I was entranced, and I've been a Korngold fan ever since.
Oh, there've been so many good composers. I mean, Max Steiner comes to mind, and a number of others. And it's in some respects a shame that film composers don't get the recognition that they really deserve.
There was an LP circa 1962 from Warner Brothers celebrating the inimitable scores of Eric Wolfgang Korngold across 12 different films, and that spearheaded a whole range of new recordings, LPs. Charles Gerhardt was the conductor, and composers of the caliber of which you were speaking were then recognized and became very popular in terms of fans listening and having access to high quality recordings of the scores. Because quite often it was only on television that you could see these films. They were very rarely presented in cinemas. Unless you were living perhaps in New York, where they had access to prints, or in London at the National Film Theatre, where they too had great access to great films of the past. And it's in recent times that we have emulated here. When you think of Melbourne Cinematheque, for example, Peter, at ACMI, on a weekly basis, they screen films from across the whole spectrum of world cinema. And sometimes they'll do what film festivals used to do comprehensively, create retrospectives around a director, sometimes around a composer or a photographer. We live in great times, Peter, and we live in a great city for that sort of film culture to be able to flourish.
Yes, absolutely agree. Now, your book is dotted with some really fascinating films. I mean, one of the most important that's very early in your book is Charles Laughton's film Night of the Hunter, which is such an amazing film. And it's a shame he didn't make more films.
It's a tragedy he didn't make more films, because that film, which pushed a lot of boundaries in 1950s United States, which had been subject to a great deal of conservative, I'm thinking of the McCarthy era and things like that. They weren't ready for a film noir of this caliber, where the main nastiness of the piece, played by Robert Mitchum, was in fact a so-called preacher with murderous intentions. Conservative America wasn't ready for that, but the rest of the world was. And when it finally got the recognition it deserved, because both critics and audiences at the time disliked the film enormously, but photographed by Stanley Cortez, who photographed Orson Welles' second film, The Magnificent Ambersons. It's a wonderful exercise, not just an exercise, it's a wonderful example of film noir at its best, of Americana, Southern Americana at its best. And bringing him back to the screen, who should return but none other than Lillian Gish, who'd been in the very earliest days of cinema with D.W. Griffith. One thinks of Birth of a Nation, Orphans of the Storm, and so on. And it was a great privilege for film goers in 1978, was it, 79, that Lillian Gish came to Melbourne to present uh, an afternoon with Lillian Gish based on her then newly released autobiography. Its title was Movies, Mr. Griffith and Me. Well, she was a living link, Peter, with that glorious past. And here she was in Melbourne at the Princess. The place was packed out. And she showed examples from her films, spoke wonderfully about Mr. Griffith, putting reasserting his position as the father of American film. And although he didn't invent the close-up or whatever, nonetheless, he used cinema as a dramatic means of telling great stories. And after a while, she asked for questions from the audience, which was really lovely. People did. And eventually I put up my hand and I said, what was it like working with Charles Lawton on Night of the Hunter? Charles was a child, she said. And then she went on to explain how wonderful he was with actors, being an actor himself. But nonetheless, he'd learnt the entire craft of cinema: audio, sound, music, photography, and particularly performance. And that was a great occasion, Peter. Again, a highlight of Melbourne film buffery, as you might say.
Yes. Oh, what an experience. That's terrific. Now, you are a filmmaker as well. We should mention you've made documentary films. You went to Toorak Teachers College. You graduated from the London Film School, and you worked with the Audiovisual Education Centre. So you've had quite a lot of experiences, not just behind the scenes, but in front of the scenes in terms of
I,
making films.
I talked my way into the education department because Gil Brealey had some years previously to me had been a teacher with the education department, didn't make films for the department, but was seconded up to the State Film Centre, which we now know as ACME, and he made films there. And that began his career with the Commonwealth Film Unit, Film Australia. And then, of course, he went on and spearheaded the development of the South Australian Film Corporation and won AFI awards all over the place for Annie's Coming Out and so on. But all that was in the future. I had been literally and figuratively knocking on my supervisor's door, Mr. Ed Perry. If ever there was a film to be made, I'd be there. And the opportunity did arise. They wanted a new film to show new approaches in art education. So I worked with Lee Wright, the cinematographer. We made a little film called All My Own Work, which promptly won the AFI award as Best Educational Film for that year.
Mm.
And that began a nearly 15, 20-year career with the education department, a staff of 12. I had some marvellous people working with me: Ivan Gull, Peter Dodds, David Hughes, sound recording. And one of our films currently is on YouTube, he said, plugging it shamelessly. And that's a documentary made on the choreographer Margaret Barr, a dance drama teacher who had studied with Martha Graham back in the early days. And the film Margaret Barr, if you enter into YouTube, just Margaret Barr, choreographer, video, up comes our 40-minute film, which also gained an honourable mention at the 1979 AFI Awards.
Ah, how very interesting to hear that. Check that out. Now, with your strong involvement with projection and with understanding the whole notion of how to project Cinerama and so CinemaScope and so on, all the different formats that had to compete against television, etc. How did that all work for you? And does digital camera technology, film technology, is that an opportunity or is that a bit of sadness?
For 10 years, Ken Parfrey, John Kurtsumis and I supervised the screenings for the Melbourne Film Festival at the upstairs theatre at the Forum. It was back in the glory days with Tate Brady and Sandra Stralage. And we had enormous enthusiasm to get it right. Because when you consider that a whole army of people have worked on any given film, it's a great collaboration, any motion picture film, from the director, screenwriter down. All of those people whose titles come up at the end of the film, whose credits are there, they're part of the creative process. it's incumbent upon us as projectionists to be able to make certain that that film, their work, is shown in absolutely perfect conditions. High quality light, needle sharp focus, all of which can vary, and high quality sound, specially equalized for the auditorium. So it was with great pleasure that we did that. You may remember, Peter, the still today upstairs at the Forum. It's a very steep rake. The seating goes up
Yeah.
any number of seats. It's great for mountain climbers. I've always maintained. But we were so busy running up and down in preparation. We had an aerobics program worked out every day, basically, just by the sheer preparation of film and sound. They were great days.
Okay. Yes. Well, that was quite an experience,
Oh,
and I.
get back to your point. Get back
Yes.
to your point about digital. That's important too.
Yes.
The digital revolution was, in fact, masterminded, certainly brought about by the distribution arm of the industry. They wanted to be able to send films out to cinemas. They knew the technology was there, which would supplant 25 kilos of each can of motion picture film to be lugged up and down stairs and so on, and the heavy freight costs that involved. They knew that in a digital form, the distribution of these films could be done through the ether, through the cloud. Quite extraordinary. But there was a price to pay. There was a price to pay, in a sense that film itself has an organic photographic quality, which is quite particular, quite unique. It's mimicked, in a sense, by the digital format, and very successfully so too. Not entirely, but it's incumbent, nonetheless, for both the operators and, dare I say, the cinema owners to make certain that the equipment is up to date, that it's been revitalized, that the lamp is running at full intensity and not running below intensity in order to conserve power, in order to save money. It has to be there. It can be quite brilliant, and it can be quite disastrous as well. So it's incumbent nonetheless still on the what remains of the projection staff to ensure that audiences are getting the best that they're substantially paying for.
Yes. Absolutely. No, no. I'm so glad that you're so fastidious about that. Look, my Zoom is telling me it's going to run out very shortly, but just talking about Australian cinema and On the Beach being such an amazing film from the late 50s when Hollywood came to Australia for the end of the world, and and other Australian cinema. What's your view on how Australian cinema has progressed?
There was a wonderful renaissance of Australian cinema circa 1970s. For 40 years, we'd wandered in the Anglophone wilderness dominated by Hollywood and Pinewood, Peter, as you well know. So
Yes.
when the government, first of all with John Gorton and then with Gough Whitlam, started to encourage filmmaking with direct grants and so on, we blossomed. And the talent that we always had was shown to great advantage. Wonderful film after another. We were fortunate in the AVEC film unit to be paralleling that development as well. You listen to Adam Elliott on another one of your podcasts, another one of your Q&As, and he says how difficult it is now to get finance for
Mm.
films, to get a film up and running, even for someone like Adam Elliott, an Academy Award winner.
Mm.
So uh, times do change, Peter, and we have to adapt. But we're capable of the very best, both certainly in terms of our actors and performers, our screenwriters. We punch so well above our station, as it were, and always have.
Yep.
There's a whole galaxy of film actors, indicate in the book, a whole range of technicians and so on who've made it big internationally. So
Yes.
there's much to be proud of, much to be proud of.
Absolutely, fully endorse that. Well, look, this is just the tip of the iceberg of what we've been discussing that's in your book, Ross. It's amazing how much detail is covered, and it's such a great read. And for any film buffs out there who love film, they should get Melbourne and the Movies. Yes, there it is. Confessions of a Certified Cinephile. And it's a terrific book, and we've been speaking to the author of Melbourne and the Movies, Ross Campbell. Ross, thank you so much for talking with me.
It's been a great pleasure. Peter. A great honour. Goodbye for now.
Thank you. Bye bye.